Okay. His statement says that the commissioner.
Gentlemen,
There he is. There he is.
I have a statement which I will read you. You have a press release that is very important document and some copies of the rules. So at exactly 9 o'clock, I'll begin to read the statement.
The commissioner's here. He's about to make his words. He has quoted Pete. Here's a quote from the release. Peter Edward Rose acknowledges that the commissioner has a factual basis to impose the penalty provided, accepts the penalty imposed by him by the commissioner, and agrees not to challenge that penalty in court or otherwise. So it appears that whatever deal Pete Rose struck out of this situation is not much of a deal for Pete. He's been banned for life. The commissioner in his statement, and here is the commissioner.
This morning, after I read my statement, I'll take any questions you have. Deputy Commissioner Benson, if necessary, will be able to assist. This is my statement. The banishment for life of Pete Rose from baseball is the sad end of a sorry episode. One of the game's greatest players has engaged in a variety of acts which have stained the game.
We apologize for the quality of the audio you're hearing from New York. This is pool audio, which CNN cannot control. We're working to improve the situation as soon as possible.
Evidence and information contained in the report of the Special Counsel to the Commissioner. Mr. Rose accepted baseball's ultimate sanction, his lifetime ineligibility. This sorry episode began last February when baseball received firm allegations Mr. Rose bet on baseball games and on the Reds games. Such grave charges could not and must never be ignored. Accordingly, I engaged in Mr. Uberov's, the commissioner appointed, John Dowd, as special counsel to investigate these and any other allegations that might arise and to pursue the truth wherever it took him. I believe then and I believe now such a process whereby an experienced professional inquires on behalf of the commissioner as the commissioner's agent is fair and appropriate. Pretend that serious charges of any kind can be responsibly examined by a commissioner alone fails to recognize the necessity to bring professionalism and fairness to any examination and the complexity of private entity encounters when without traditional legal powers it pursues allegations in the complex real world. Baseball had never before undertaken such a process because there had not been such grave allegations since the time of Landis. If one is responsible for protecting the integrity of the game of baseball, that is, the game's authenticity, coherence, and honesty, then the process one uses to protect the integrity of baseball must itself embody that integrity. I sought by means of a special counsel of proven professionalism and integrity who was obliged to keep the subject of the investigation and his representatives informed about key information, create a mechanism whereby the integrity we sought to protect was itself never violated. Similarly, in writing to Mr. Rose on May 11, I designed, as is my responsibility, a set of procedures for a hearing that would have afforded him every opportunity to present statements or testimony of witnesses or any other evidence he saw fit to answer the information and evidence presented in the report of the special counsel and its accompanying materials. That Mr. Rose and his counsel chose to pursue a course in the courts rather than appear at hearings scheduled for May 25 or then June 26, and then chose to come forward with a stated desire to settle the matter is now well known to all. My purpose in recounting the process and the procedures animating the process is to make 2 points that the American public deserve to know. First, that the integrity of the game cannot be defended except by a process that itself embodies integrity and fairness. Second, should any other occasion arise when charges are made or acts are said to be committed that are contrary to the interests of the game or that undermine the integrity of baseball, I fully intend to use such a process and procedure to get to the truth, and if need be, to root out offending behavior. I intend to use, in short, every lawful and ethical means to defend and protect the game. I say this so that there may be no doubt about where I stand or why I stand there. I believe baseball is a beautiful and exciting game loved by millions, I among them, and I believe baseball is an important, enduring American institution. It must assert and aspire to the highest principles of integrity, of professionalism of performance, of fair play within the rules. It will come as no surprise that, like any institution composed of human beings, this institution will not always fulfill its highest aspirations. I know of no earthly institution that does. But this one, because it is so much a part of our history as a people, and because it has such a purchase on our national soul, has an obligation to the people for whom it's played, fans and the well-wishers and the millions, to strive for excellence in all things and to promote the highest ideals. I will be told that I am an idealist. I hope so. I will continue to locate ideals I hold for myself and my country in the national game as well as in other of our national institutions. And while there will be debate and dissent about this or that or another occurrence on or off the field, and while the game's nobler parts will always be enmeshed in the human frailties of those who, whatever their role, have stewardship of this game, let there be no doubt or dissent about our goals for baseball or our dedication to it, nor about our vigilance and vigor and indeed our patience in protecting the game from blemish or stain or disgrace. The matter of Mr. Rose is now closed. It will be debated and discussed. Let no one think that it did not hurt baseball. That hurt will pass, however, as the great glory of the game asserts itself and a resilient institution goes forward. Let it also be clear that no individual is superior to the game.
Have you now concluded personally that Rose bet on baseball games and on his own team?
If, in the absence of a hearing, and therefore in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, I am confronted by the factual record of Mr. Dowd, and on the basis of that, yes, I have concluded that he bet on baseball. Wait a minute, no, wait, don't scream. We're going to be here all day if you want. Just take it easy. No, you've seen all the evidence I saw. Yes. I have concluded that the factual basis presented in the Dowd report, which has not been challenged by any contrary evidence, which was not challenged in any sense by a hearing, because Mr. Rose did not want a hearing, therefore represents the factual basis. And I've concluded that, therefore, I believe what the Dowd report evidences. Now, there are a number of reasons for the permanent ineligibility and the placement on the ineligible list, to use the technical language, for the lifetime ban. Not confined to the issue of baseball. There are admitted violations, and you've all read the report. We're not here to reread the report together. Consorting with gamblers and other matters, including, while it's not my obligation to uphold state and federal laws, nor is it my obligation to be ignorant or indifferent to the violation of them, there are any number of reasons, including baseball, and betting on baseball and on the Reds, that account for the action I've taken today.
Your investigation continues even after the Dowd report. Have you now evidence that Rose placed bets even in 1989?
No, I haven't got such evidence at this point. The investigation, as you know, because the last sentence of it said that the investigation is continuing, the investigation has got, it seems to me, several strands which need to be knitted up, and then when Mr. Dowd submits those to me, that will be the end of it.
How and when does this agreement between you and Pete Rose come about?
The agreement, which essentially is an adoption of a position that I held from the time it seemed that there was serious talk about not going to a hearing. Well, actually, it's an evolutionary process. I'm going to frankly turn to the Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Vincent, because At the end of April, I believe,
Correct.
Mr. Dowd received from Mr. Makeley, on behalf of either Mr. Pitcairn or Mr. Katz, a call saying that there was a desire to talk. Is that right, John? Mr. Dowd called me, and I said that just as I had asked Mr. Dowd to be my agent in order to be able to both put distance and yet connection to the investigation, so it would be inappropriate for me to be sitting in any conversation which was initiated by Mr. Rose's representatives. And therefore, if Mr. Makeley or anybody else wanted to talk about whatever they want to talk about, they should talk to Mr. Vincent. I will now turn to Mr. Vincent, who will give you an account of the evolution of a few conversations, and that will answer your question, but it will also establish for you, and I don't want this to impede a few of you in the room, it will establish some facts. Go ahead.
Thank you. As Bart said, the first discussion about a resolution occurred at the end of April in Dayton. I flew to Dayton on a Saturday morning. Mr. Katz, representing Mr. Rose, told me that he had some thoughts. He asked me to come to Dayton to accommodate him, and I did so. He made some proposals to me which I rejected as being unrealistic in light of the circumstances as I then knew them. The proposals involved Pete admitting some misbehavior not spelled out, some public service, some discussion of charitable contribution. And I responded that it seemed to me, remember this was before the report was published, but nevertheless we had considerable information. It seemed to me that the circumstances, the reality of baseball's disciplinary history, including the DeRocher case, where there was a year suspension for consorting with gamblers, meant that that proposal by Mr. Katz was not one that I would recommend to the commissioner that we pursue. That was the end of that. There were no further discussions for a considerable period of time. Toward the end of July, once again, we were approached, would we meet, would I meet, and talk about a resolution. I did so. I met with Mr. Katz here in New York. We spent considerable time on the subject, and we developed three issues on which we had major disagreement. The first was the term permanent ineligibility. At that point, my position representing the commissioner was we wanted the suspension, if you will, to be reflected in the terms of our rule. It's the only term we know how to use. And we discussed the phrase permanent ineligibility. Secondly, we discussed reinstatement. What was our position on reinstatement? Our position, I said, was the rule. The Rule 15C says a person who's put on the ineligible list may apply for reinstatement after 1 year. The rule is fine with us. It's the rule we live by. I said, however, that any such application must be made solely in the discretion of the commissioner. There would be no understanding with respect to time, what the commissioner would do, and there could be no legal challenge to any judgment made by the commissioner on such a application for reinstatement. And thirdly, I said we would not accept a document in which Pete Rose denied he bet on baseball. We could not do that in the absence of a specific hearing and finding by the commissioner. Those discussions fell apart, and then last Friday, Mr. Katz called me again and basically told me they would accept, with some minor word changes, the position that I had previously told him I would recommend to the commissioner. And so this resolution comes as a result of some intensive discussions that began last Friday.
Is there any compromise on the part of baseball in these negotiations?
No, there was one position. As soon as it seemed in late July that there was a serious effort on the part of Mr. Rose's representatives to ask us to come to an arrangement in order to not have a hearing, my view was that at that point, I had to think about what did I think about the report. This goes back to an earlier question. As if as if there were no hearing. If the report were to stand, including Pete Rose's sworn testimony and his 2 days of deposition included in the report, if the report had to stand on itself and would not be challenged because there wouldn't be a hearing, which was obviously the intent of the tender to talk, then I had to say to myself, what would you think if you had to make a judgment and this factual base is uncontested, as would be the case if Mr. Rose didn't want to come to a hearing? And at that point, I thought about it a long time, and taking the totality of the documentary evidence and the totality of the corroborative testimony, taking into account the things which later became admitted to, as well as other inconsistencies, et cetera, I decided that there was no position I could take honorably on that basis except permanent ineligibility. And that is when Mr. Vincent was instructed by me to listen, to be open, but that there was not to be negotiation on my position, as I told the press a number of times, or any negotiation on the principle of permanent ineligibility. That with regard to time frame, there was an open mind on my part. There is a rule, which you've all read and you have. I am not going to try and either undermine or through waiver or anything else change the rule. I live with the rules. This whole episode is about whether you live by the rules or not. And as Mr. Vincent explained, if there isn't to be a hearing, and therefore is not to be a formal finding by me, one way or the other as a result of the hearing, then it wasn't acceptable to me that there could be a denial. If there was a no-low plea, a no contest, if you will, fine, here. But to answer the question, what was the negotiation? It really wasn't a negotiation. As Mr. Vincent has described to you, in late July at least, there was a position that I took because I had to take a position in order to instruct him how to converse. I could have done it myself, but I'm trying also to leave open the possibility, and that has happened at least twice, the conversations would break down and there would in fact be a hearing. But I had to take a judgment, make a judgment as if there wouldn't be a hearing in order to be able to have him know what in fact our position was. And what happened was a gradual evolution towards the adoption of what was our position. Now, I have been remiss in not asking you, please, to stand up so that others can hear, please. Yes, let's start here. Sir.
What does Pete Rose have to do? What does he have to prove to you that after a year it perhaps makes you favorable for a petition for reinstatement? Do you think he needs treatment or?
Well, first of all, the burden is entirely on Mr. Rose. The burden is not on me. I think it's completely premature for me to stand here today and begin to talk about what he has a right to do a year from now. So I'm not going to do it, frankly. It isn't up to me. It is up to Mr. Rose, it seems to me, to reconfigure his life in ways that I assume he would prefer. I can't remember the second part of your question. I was so enthralled with my answer. Excuse me, what was the second? Treatment. Oh, treatment. With all due respect, my friends, I do not practice clinical psychology or psychiatry by remote control. I don't think it's appropriate. I think, frankly, it's patronizing. As Mr. Vincent, I think, indicated at one point in the conversation, I think it was your April conversation, the question of treatment came up. We have not required it. It seems to me entirely and completely in Mr. Rose's hands. I am not going to stand here and pretend to an expertise I do not possess and tell you that I can confidently assert that a person is ill or not ill when I'm neither a physician nor psychologist, nor indeed have I spoken to Mr. Rose. So it seems to me that a person who wished to establish the kind of record that would then sustain a request or an application, even to get considered, would want to take whatever steps it seemed to that person appropriate to be persuasive. But I'm not here to prescribe them, to dictate them, nor to diagnose. Would you stand up, sir? I'm having a hard time hearing you with the whirring. I'm sorry, sir. Yes. There's no such thing as betting legally on baseball if you are, if you have a duty to perform in that game in any sense of the word. There's been a lot of talk about gambling, and it is an interesting and complicated subject because on the one hand there is public policy now, which I, as a private citizen, have always profoundly disagreed with, whereby states, in my opinion, exploit a human weakness because politicians are perhaps not as interested in making hard choices in the reallocation of budgets. I don't happen to agree with the legalization of gambling in that sense of the word by the state, but it's happened, and there it is. The fact is, however, that gambling is a covert and essentially conspiratorial act, particularly illegal gambling, which is what we're talking about here. It places the individual who engages in it, if he or she is a member of a team, in a very real conflict of interest because they place their interests and need and hope for gain ahead of their professional and public duty, which is to perform as a member of a team. The more one associates with gamblers, the more perhaps one loses, and it's very hard to win. The more one is both enthralled or in their thrall, and frankly, the more information there is in the world that a member of a sports organization is in fact betting. There are therefore any number of reasons why gambling is corrosive of the essential principle of any game, which is that two individuals or two groups compete under identical conditions of rules and equipment and norms, and that merit or skill and not some covert preoccupation are what are being tested. I think baseball's gambling rule, which came in my memory in about 1928, I believe Judge Landis thereby reacting to the allegations concerning Speaker and Cobb in 26, is a very wise rule because it essentially assesses what integrity means. Integrity means open, authentic, honest, above-board behavior without which no sport can have any credibility and therefore any life. Yes, sir. I have said to Mr. Katz, and the only conversation I had with Mr. Katz in this whole 6-month period that began yesterday, 6 months ago yesterday, Mr. Dowd began this process. Yesterday afternoon, about 20 minutes before the document to be signed at 4 o'clock, Mr. Katz had been told by Mr. Vincent, well, why doesn't Mr. Vincent tell you? Because it's part of their conversation, and I'll answer your question.
Well, Mr. Katz had asked me whether I could assure him that Bart would have an open mind with respect to reinstatement. That is, did the commissioner have a specific number of years before he would entertain consideration of an application for reinstatement? I said I was confident both that the commissioner had no such term in mind and that Bart would confirm that to Mr. Katz, and Bart did so.
That is therefore the occasion of my call. Mr. Vincent said, I have pledged to Mr. Katz that you will call him proceeding to the signing to assure him of what I know is the case, which is that you will have an open mind and that you don't have in your mind, nor is there anywhere in this universe any fixed term, that everything that's in the document, as the document says, is all that there is agreed to, no less and no more. And I called Mr. Katz and gave him that assurance, and that's the answer to you, sir. No, I don't. Sir. Why do I think that Mr. Rose didn't want a hearing? With all due respect, boss, you're going to have to ask Mr. Rose that. I can speak to what Mr. Rose has signed his name to here and has attested to But with all due respect to you, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot speculate, nor would I, nor would it be appropriate on why Mr. Rose said, thought, or did other things. Yes?
Distinction between betting for a team or betting the Reds to lose, and is there any suggestion that Rose bet on them to lose, even though he did not control a game?
I know of no evidence to show that Mr. Rose bet against the Reds, and in my opinion, the wisdom of Landis's rule is that it does not make any difference whether you bet for or against. The act of betting on a game you're involved with is per se, in my opinion, and in the rule's opinion, is per se to put yourself at variance with your public and stated duty. It is to place your desire for gain, monetary gain, and therefore perhaps to put your judgment about what should happen on the field, etc., ahead of the team. It makes no difference, in my opinion, nor in the rules, whether the wager is for or against. It is the act of, covert act of wagering that is the issue. Yes, sir. And I said, sir, and I'm saying it this way because the document, which I know you will all read very carefully, says very clearly that I have not had a hearing, and therefore there is no formal finding. But understanding that there is not a formal finding, which could only be the result of a formal hearing, and in the absence of any defense, contrary evidence, etc., offered, I believe, on the basis of the factual record before me and the document Mr. Rose has signed, I remind you, acknowledges that there is a factual basis for my finding. I find, personally, that he, yes, I believe the document.
Are you troubled by the portion of the statement where it says Mr. Rose neither denies nor admits that he bet on baseball?
No, I'm not troubled by it. I can't, in the absence of the strappado, sir, I am not in a position to coerce anybody into saying anything. Indeed, you can always coerce me because I'm so malleable and sweet, but basically Mr. Rose has said in this document that he will neither affirm nor deny that he bet on baseball. I have said that Mr. Rose is banished for life, and we have cited the rule, and that is the long and the short of it. Had there been a hearing, and had Mr. Rose come to the hearing, or had he not come to the hearing, but had been represented as denying it, and I had therefore found that, as I had on the basis of any credible evidence to the contrary, that what is the case is the case, Mr. Rose could be saying whatever he wanted to. This says that he will not affirm or deny. It's a kind of no contest. And as far as I'm concerned, the result is the result that could only grow from the most grave allegations of a variety of kinds being taken as true. Yes, sir. You've asked the question that my friend asked before. I can't answer Pete Rose's questions. If you want to know what Pete Rose's view of this is, I would urge you to ask Pete Rose, but I can only speak for myself.
Mr. Giamatti, in several interviews, Ron Peters has stated that there were other professional athletes among his clients. Yet nowhere in his deposition is he asked that specific question, or whether any other clients are baseball players.
I'm sorry, sir. My information, and to my knowledge, you're incorrect on both assertions. But Mr. Dowd, who has in fact has spoken to Mr. Peters at more length than certainly I have, because I've never spoken to him, why doesn't Mr. Dowd answer that question? Because let's clarify that error of fact. John, come up here. I think
At the time that we interviewed Mr. Peters, the only information we knew was what he had given us. But he had been asked during the course of the investigation by my investigators whether he took bets from any other Major League Baseball player or employee. His answer was in the negative. After this matter was raised, I believe in a column in the Cincinnati paper, I spoke with Mr. Peters at the Terre Haute Federal Prison Camp, and he affirmed again that he never took any bets from any other Major League employee or baseball player.
At this point,
Okay? Do you want to follow up? Because
At this
that's
point,
as
we're
clear as we
interrupting
can get
to
it.
offer local cable operators the opportunity to present commercial messages.
That's correct, because it was not a subject that he had indicated to us. The deposition was focused on the purpose of the investigation, which was Mr. Rose. But he had been asked, and my files reflect that he has been asked, and Mr. Daly's files reflect he'd been asked, and he said no. So there's no reason to ask him in the deposition. Okay?
Yes, sir? What effect will this 6-month episode have on the game and on my office and on me, which is to put them in the order of descending order? The effect on the game, I hope, will be to strengthen the confidence of the American public that serious allegations that would damage the game or undermine its integrity will be pursued vigorously and dealt with appropriately. The game is an institution as well as a sport. It is probably stronger for this. As I said in my statement, in the end, of course this hurts, and it hurts because it shakes people's confidence. That's why the commissionership was invented, to maintain the kind of vigilance that ensures the public's confidence, else the public may decide not to come and watch it anymore. I think the game will...
After a pause for local cable operations to offer opportunities for announcements, we're rejoining the Baseball Commissioners' News Conference in New York on the barring of Pete Rose from baseball.
I and future commissioners will pursue this with every vigilance and lawful and ethical means at our disposal. So I think in the long run, the American people in the game gain, although it's through a difficult and at times heart-rending process. The effect on my office is interesting. While I did not enjoy the leisurely cruise through various courts in the quite beautiful state of Ohio, the fact remains that the quite remarkable opinion of Judge Holshoe, which settled to his and everybody else's, including the Sixth Circuit's satisfaction, the issue of jurisdiction, contains an extremely well-written, I dare say almost eloquent, definition of the commissionership and affirms the law concerning the commissionership. And to the extent that the commissionership emerges from this stronger, given the document before you and given that court opinion, the commissionership is affirmed and made stronger, if that were possible, not in the scope of its powers, but in the solidity of its structure. The effect on me has been to affirm in me the fact that I have a penchant for taking jobs that tend to be interesting. Sir.
Such cooperation gives an appearance that a deal for reinstatement has been struck.
There is absolutely no deal for reinstatement. Indeed, if you were listening, as I know you were, Mr. Shaughnessy, closely to Mr. Vincent, you will remember that he said that was exactly what we did not agree to in terms of any fixed number of years or anything else regarding reinstatement. There is a standing major league rule on the subject. It is not Pete Rose's rule. It is not Bart Giamatti's rule. It is not a rule that was created for this occasion. It is a standing rule, 15C. It speaks entirely to the matter. There is no automaticity. There is no guarantee. It simply says one must wait a year before one can apply for reinstatement. Our document says nothing in the document should be construed as denying the right to a person on the ineligible list as spelled out in 15C. That's all it says. It then goes on to say that it is in the complete and sole discretion of the commissioner, as to whether that application for reinstatement would be looked on favorably, and that in any case Mr. Rose or his representatives may not in any sense, by order of court or anything else, challenge the commissioner, either this commissioner or any future commissioner's judgment. It also says in the document, Mr. Shaughnessy, that there is no agreement or understanding or deal or sidebar or wink or whisper that is not reflected in the document. And while it may astonish you to know it, that's in fact the truth. So clinging, as some of you must, given some of the reporting last night, to the notion that there's a fixed term of years, whomever your sources were, do not trust them because they misled you. There is no deal. There is a resolution by agreement on terms that I find wholly acceptable. Sir. I'm sorry, sir, I cannot hear. I'm sorry. Well, we have one.
What are the civil or criminal penalties for responding to calls and questions under oath on our oath?
What are the civil or criminal penalties, sir, for...
Sir, with all due respect, though we have ample jurisdiction and authority over baseball, that issue is not our issue. And I commend others to you for that question. It's not for us to answer.
Yes, sir? I don't know of any precedents. I don't know whether my reading in baseball history, like yours, which reflected that members of the Black Sox constantly reapplied to no avail, will be in fact reflected in baseball's records. I doubt it. I don't think I have any records that go back that far. I don't think there is a precedent because I don't think that there has been anybody placed on the permanently ineligible list in quite this way, No, I can't think of any. Is that right? I can't think of any. Yeah, sure. Well, I've said to you before, I'm not going to stand here and start to talk about that now. It's, if I may put it bluntly, a tad premature. It seems to me that the burden is on Mr. Rose, not on me. And I've said that before, and I'm going to simply leave it at that. Sir. I'm sorry, sir. Do I find it troubling that shortly after Mr. Rose signed a document, I take it yesterday, he was on television selling autographed baseballs? Technically, sir, as soon as Mr. Rose had signed this document, Mr. Rose was no longer employed or employable in baseball. Mr. Rose was there at a free citizen on the permanently ineligible list. Practically speaking, that has happened this morning, but technically, it happened the instant his signature and that of Mr. Katz were affixed to the documents. I have no comment on Mr. Rose's behavior. I will say that confident steps towards rehabilitation, it seems to me, ought to be taken in a direction that has not been the direction hitherto taken. And I think I'll stop there. I'd like to go back to Steve, and then I'll come over here. Sir? Yes, sir? No, because permanent ineligibility means lifetime banishment. Major League Baseball had an existing rule, 15C, which I will abide by because all it says is that one may, in this very small group of people who are in the permanently ineligible class, you have to be in that class in order to avail yourself of this right. It is not a group I would urge any of us to wish to join. It only consists of one person. But if you are permanently ineligible, you have the right after a year. I have no interest or really no grounds to try and override or coerce the consent of anybody else to override an existing rule. My view is I'm going to go by the rules. And that's it, Steve. Sir. I'm glad I wondered when I'd be asked about the Hall of Fame. Let me say this. This episode has been about, in many ways, taking responsibility and taking responsibility for one's own acts. I know I need not point out to the baseball writers of America that it is their responsibility who decides who goes into the Hall of Fame. It is not mine. You have the authority and you have the responsibility, and you will make your own individual judgments, and when they are tallied by Mr. Lang, that will be it. I have never, as league president or commissioner, and would never, in this or any other instance, express an opinion about the eligibility, viability, or appropriateness of any candidate for the Hall of Fame. It is entirely in your, now you have a responsibility, which I, of course, as a devoted reader of all of you, will look forward to listening and watching your debates on the relationship of life to art, which you will all have to work out for yourselves. Sure. No, I have absolutely no grounds for thinking I would have done anything different. I never underestimate anybody's legal resilience. Any citizen in this country has every right to avail him or herself of the judicial system and to construct whatever defense they wish. It was clear to me that if one didn't want to come to a hearing, one would go to court. It was also clear to me, as time went on, that if one didn't feel one had a very good defense against the Dowd report, then the best thing to do would be to attack the process, me, and the rest of it, and that's exactly what happened. I can't say I was surprised by it, but I wouldn't have done anything sooner, as I've said repeatedly to the press, because it seems to me to have, for instance, suspended Mr. Rose sooner would have, I think, then genuinely left me liable to the charge of prejudging. And therefore I decided that I would not do that, that we would see this through. Yes, you want to go again? I can't hear you, sir.
Does that mean that if the situation were repeated, that you would not do, and you don't feel any, like you share any of the culpability at all? You don't feel that the fact that it dragged on 6 months?
I didn't go to court, sir. I don't feel culpable. I didn't do any of the things alleged in the Dowd report, sir. Have you read the Dowd report? Oh, good. I haven't done any of those things. I didn't create the rules. All I did was initiate and see through an investigation. I didn't take anybody to court. I was taken to court. I don't feel culpable on any grounds, and I would be fascinated and intrigued to know on what grounds you think I should be. But we'll talk about that another time. Sir. No. I wrote to the judge, I signed a letter to the judge that reflected the views of Mr. Dowd. That letter says very clearly that I was reflecting the views of special counsel, particularly as corroborated by other evidence. I then forgot about that letter because it to me was an act of transmittal of what were Mr. Dowd's views, and Mr. Dowd is welcome to his views. So I'm frankly have not dwelled on it then or since. But the process, you see, I tried to say in the statement, when one is, I hesitate to use the phrase in uncharted waters, but when one is engaged in a process that has no precedent, where there is no pre-existent model, where one lives in a time that is both litigious and complex, then it seemed to me one of the things I spent my time on was not doing what Mr. Dowd was doing, which is why he was asked to do it, but sitting with Mr. Vincent trying to make sure that the procedures were as impeccable from the point of view of impartiality and fairness and insofar as we can replicate or have an obligation kind of fundamental principles of justice as humanly possible, because there was nothing to rely on. At this point, as I said before, should allegations of this severity or allegations that would damage the game or its integrity arise, there is now a process and a set of procedures, and I would not hesitate to use them again, sir. Yes, sir?
We have been watching for the past 3/4 of an hour a news conference by Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti in which he announced the permanent banishment of Cincinnati Reds manager Pete Rose from baseball. So Pete Rose, after 6 months of legal wrangling and continual flow of press reports, rumors and counter-rumors, is out of organized baseball. Commissioner Giamatti, announcing the news to a corps of press reporters, sports reporters in New York City, said that although Rose neither admitted nor denied having bet on baseball games, specifically on games played by his own Cincinnati Reds, he acknowledges, in the commissioner's words, that the commissioner has a factual basis to impose the penalty provided. And the penalty just provided Pete Rose, after a career of 2 decades and more in Major League Baseball, is to be ousted from the game for life. If ever it could be said of a man that the now trite expression, "baseball is my life," is true, that would be Pete Rose. Baseball Commissioner Giamatti said that under terms of organized baseball's charter, Pete Rose can apply for reinstatement, perhaps as manager or in some other capacity, to take a role once again actively in organized baseball after a period of 1 year. He gave no indication, however, that might be granted. He says there has been no formal finding of guilt on the part of Pete Rose. He said absolutely there has been no deal made for reinstatement, no under-the-counter or tacit agreement that after a year or 3 years or 5 years, Pete Rose would be very favorably viewed for reinstatement. He left that completely up in the air. So Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti, having permanently ousted Pete Rose from baseball, Pete Rose now faces a future without organized baseball. He will be expected to be certainly in some capacity on the periphery of the game, but he will not be in Major League Baseball as we know it. On the question of Pete Rose's eligibility for the Hall of Fame, one that had to come up and did finally, Commissioner Giamatti said it was entirely up to the baseball writers who vote for the Hall of Fame. Rose will give his own reaction at a news conference in Cincinnati less than an hour from now. Stay tuned to CNN for live coverage at 10 o'clock Eastern.